The $20 million check fluttered in the desert wind like a wounded bird, forgotten in the dust where Maverick Stonefield had dropped it. Thunder Bay, the magnificent black stallion worth more than most people's homes, had just done the unthinkable. He'd broken through the golden gates of the Stonefield estate and was galloping toward the ramshackle fence line that separated luxury from authenticity. Maverick's Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble steps as he descended from his mansion's grand entrance, his perfectly pressed suit a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding before him. The billionaire tech mogul had built his empire on predicting human behavior through algorithms, but nothing in his data models had prepared him for what he was witnessing. "Sir, should we deploy the security team?" asked his personal assistant, Quinton Ashworth, whose tablet was already buzzing with alerts from the property's sophisticated surveillance system. Maverick raised a hand, his steel-grey eyes fixed on the scene playing out across his manicured grounds. Thunder Bay wasn't just running, he was flying, his powerful legs carrying him past the climate-controlled stables, past the Olympic-sized arena, past everything that represented the pinnacle of equine luxury. The stallion's destination was becoming painfully clear. The weathered fence that marked the boundary to the neighboring ranch. On the other side of that fence stood Colton Briggs, a third-generation cowboy whose calloused hands and sun-weathered face told the story of a life spent in honest labor. His small ranch was a patchwork of necessity-repaired fences, a barn that leaked when it rained, and pastures that relied on rainfall rather than automated irrigation systems. Yet something about that humble operation had captured Thunder Bay's attention during their brief encounter 3 days ago. Maverick remembered that encounter vividly. He'd been showing off his prized stallion to potential buyers when Thunder Bay had suddenly stopped mid-stride. His ears pricked toward the sound of Colton's voice calling to his own horses. The stallion had pressed against the fence, ignoring the platinum-plated feed bucket in favor of watching the cowboy work with a gentle patience that spoke of decades spent understanding horses rather than owning them. "That horse sees something we don't," Colton had said simply, his weathered hands stroking Thunder Bay's neck. "Money can't buy what he's looking for." At the time, Maverick had dismissed the comment as folksy wisdom from a man who couldn't comprehend the level of care his wealth could provide. Now, watching Thunder Bay leap the fence with the grace of a creature born free, he wasn't so sure. The stallion landed in Colton's pasture with a thud that seemed to echo across both properties. Maverick's jaw tightened as he watched the cowboy approach his $20 million investment with nothing but an outstretched hand and a calm voice that carried on the wind. "Easy, boy," Colton murmured, and Thunder Bay responded immediately, his wild sprint slowing to a gentle trot. The stallion's sides heaved with exertion, but his eyes held a brightness that Maverick hadn't seen in months of ownership as Quinton frantically typed on his tablet, likely calculating insurance implications and legal ramifications. Maverick found himself walking toward the fence line. Each step across his perfectly manicured lawn felt like a journey into foreign territory, where his net worth meant nothing and his understanding of value was about to be completely redefined. The confrontation that followed would be talked about in horse circles for years to come. Maverick Stonefield, standing at the property line in his $1,000 suit, faced Colton Briggs across a divide that measured more than mere distance. "That's my horse," Maverick stated, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. Behind him, a convoy of security vehicles had arrived, their occupants waiting for orders to retrieve the escaped stallion. Colton didn't move from where he stood beside Thunder Bay, his weathered hand resting on the stallion's. neck. "I know whose name is on the papers," he replied quietly. "But maybe you should ask Thunder Bay whose horse he thinks he is." The stallion's response was immediate and unmistakable. When Maverick whistled the same whistle that had always brought Thunder Bay running during their training sessions, the horse turned his head but remained firmly planted beside the cowboy. It was a subtle rebellion, but in the world of horses, subtlety spoke volumes. "He's worth $20 million, Maverick said, his voice rising with frustration. "I've given him everything a horse could want: climate-controlled stables, professional trainers, the finest feed money can buy. Have you given him what he needs?" Colton asked, his tone remaining steady despite the tension crackling between them. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maverick's mind raced through the catalogue of luxuries he'd provided. Thunder Bay's stall was larger than most studio apartments, equipped with automatic waterers, temperature controls, and entertainment systems designed specifically for equine enrichment. The stallion's daily routine was managed by a team of experts who monitored everything from his nutrition to his exercise regimen. "Look around," Maverick gestured toward his pristine facility. "Every detail has been optimized for his comfort and performance. What could you possibly offer that I can't?" Colton's answer came not in words but in action. He walked toward the center of his modest pasture, and Thunder Bay followed without any visible cue or command. The stallion's ears were forward, his steps light with an energy that seemed to come from within rather than from any external motivation. "Freedom," Colton said simply, turning to face Maverick. "The choice to roll in the dirt when he wants to eat grass instead of processed pellets, to interact with other horses as equals rather than as breeding stock or showpieces." As if to emphasize the point, Thunder Bay lowered his head and began to graze, his powerful neck stretching down to tear at the simple prairie grass. It was a sight that struck Maverick as both beautiful and troubling. This magnificent creature, worth more than most people's life savings, choosing weeds over the scientifically formulated feed that had been prepared for him. "I can provide companionship," Maverick countered, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I have other horses. Do you?" Colton's question was gentle but pointed. "Or do you have investments that happen to be horses?" The words hit harder than Maverick cared to admit. He thought of his stable, each horse isolated in its own stall, their interactions limited to controlled breeding or training sessions. Every relationship was managed, every behavior monitored and optimized for performance or profit. Thunder Bay lifted his head from the grass, and for a moment his dark eyes met Maverick's across the fence. In that gaze, the billionaire saw something he'd spent his entire life trying to quantify but had never truly understood. Contentment that couldn't be bought, joy that couldn't be programmed, and a peace that existed beyond the reach of his considerable wealth. The security team shifted restlessly behind him, waiting for the order to retrieve the escaped stallion. Quinton continued his frantic note-taking, likely already drafting legal documents. But Maverick found himself unable to speak, confronted by a truth that all his success had somehow failed to teach him. That night, Maverick Stonefield stood in his private study, surrounded by the trophies and awards that chronicled Thunder Bay's show career. Each gleaming cup and ribbon represented a victory, a moment when horse and handler had achieved perfect synchronization. Yet as he studied the photographs of Thunder Bay in the winner's circle, something about the stallion's expression began to trouble him. The horse's eyes, even in his moments of greatest triumph, held a distance that Maverick had never noticed. Before, it was the look of an animal performing rather than living, executing commands rather than expressing his true nature. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Quinton entered with a steaming cup of coffee and a thick folder of documents. "I've prepared the legal papers for retrieval," his assistant announced. "The sheriff's department is ready to assist, and our insurance company has been notified of the situation." Maverick accepted the coffee but didn't touch the folder. Instead, he found himself staring out the window toward the property line, where security lights illuminated the fence that separated his world from Colton's. "Tell me about the neighboring ranch," he said suddenly. Quinton's fingers flew over his tablet. "The Briggs property has been in the family for 3 generations. Current owner is Colton Briggs, age 34, no criminal record. The operation is small scale, mostly cattle with some horses. Financially, they single quotes modest." "Modest," Maverick repeated, the word feeling strange in his mouth. "How modest?" "Annual income approximately $40,000. The property is mortgaged, though payments are current. No significant assets beyond the land and livestock." Maverick set down his coffee cup, his mind working through the implications. Colton Briggs made in a year what Maverick earned in the time it took to drink his morning coffee. Yet Thunder Bay had chosen that simple life over luxury that most people couldn't. "Imagine, what do you know about horses, Quinton?" The question seemed to surprise his assistant. "Well, I've done research for your acquisitions, sir. Breeding lines, performance records, market values. But do you understand them? As animals, not as investments." Quinton's silence was answer enough. Maverick realized with a start that he couldn't answer his own question. When had he stopped seeing Thunder Bay as a magnificent creature and started seeing him as a commodity? The memory came flooding back, the first time he'd seen Thunder Bay as a yearling, running free in a pasture much like Colton's. The young stallion had been pure poetry in motion, his joy infectious and his spirit untamed. That was the horse. Maverick had fallen in love with the one he'd been determined to own, but somewhere in the process of ownership, that wild spirit had been refined away. The stallion's natural exuberance had been channeled into acceptable outlets: the show ring, the breeding barn, the carefully controlled environment of his stable. Thunder Bay had become perfect, and in becoming perfect, he'd lost something essential. "Cancel the retrieval," Maverick said quietly. "Sir, you heard me. Cancel it." Quinton's tablet nearly slipped from his hands. "But, sir, the horse is worth $20 million. We can't what?" Maverick's voice was sharper than he intended. "Can't let him be happy." The word hung in the air between them. Happy. When was the last time Maverick had considered Thunder Bay's happiness? When was the last time he'd considered his own? "I need to think," Maverick said, dismissing his assistant with a wave. "Give me the night." Alone in his study, surrounded by the evidence of Thunder Bay's manufactured success, Maverick made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd never expected. "To use Colton. It's Maverick Stonefield. We need to talk." The cowboy's voice was calm. "I figured you'd call. Thunder Bay's doing fine, by the way. Sleeping under the stars with my mares. Haven't seen him this relaxed in, well, probably since he was a colt." "I want to make a deal," Maverick said, the words coming out in a rush. "Not to buy him back, but to understand what he's found with you that I couldn't give him." The next morning found Maverick Stonefield in the most unlikely place he'd been in decades, sitting on a hay bale in Colton Briggs' barn, wearing borrowed work clothes and watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Thunder Bay stood nearby, his coat dusty and his mane tangled with burrs, looking more magnificent than he ever had in the show ring. "First lesson," Colton said, handing Maverick a worn leather halter, "is that you can't schedule a relationship. With a horse, they don't care about your agenda." The next several hours unfolded like a masterclass in everything Maverick had forgotten about horses. Under Colton's patient guidance, he learned to read Thunder Bay's body language without the intervention of professional trainers. He discovered that the stallion had preferences. He liked having his ears scratched, but not his nose. He preferred to be approached from the left side, and he had a particular fondness for the wild prairie grass that grew along the fence line. "You see how he positions himself," Colton pointed out as Thunder Bay shifted his weight, subtly blocking access to the mare grazing nearby. "He's protecting her, but he's also asking for your respect. In your fancy stables, does he get to make choices like that?" Maverick's throat tightened as he realized the answer. Every aspect of Thunder Bay's life had been controlled, managed, optimized. The stallion's natural instincts had been suppressed in favor of behaviors that served human purposes. "Why did you become a cowboy?" Maverick asked as they worked together to repair a section of fence. Colton's hands never stopped moving, his skilled fingers working the wire with practiced ease. "Same reason you became a businessman, I'd guess. It's what I understand. The difference is, I learned early that understanding horses means letting them be horses, not trying to make them into something else. The work was harder than anything Maverick had done in years. His soft hands developed blisters within the first hour, and his back ached from the unfamiliar physical labor. But there was something deeply satisfying about the simplicity of it. No emails to answer, no meetings to attend, no complex algorithms to debug. Just the basic task of maintaining the boundary that kept the horses safe while allowing them freedom. Within it, "Thunder Bay's been trying to teach you something," Colton said as they took a break, sharing water from a thermos that had seen better days. "The question is whether you're willing to learn." "What do you mean? Think about it. You're one of the smartest men in the world, built an empire on understanding patterns and predicting behavior. But you missed the most important pattern of all. Thunder Bay's been telling you what he needs, and you've been too busy giving him what you think he wants." The observation hit Maverick like a physical blow. He thought of all the expensive upgrades he'd made to Thunder Bay's environment, all the consultants he'd hired, all the technology he'd employed to ensure the stallion's optimal care. None of it had addressed the fundamental need that was now glaringly obvious: the need to be a horse rather than a showpiece. "What if I could give him both?" Maverick asked suddenly. "What if I could provide security and luxury while still allowing him his freedom?" Colton's smile was knowing. "That's the $1 million question, isn't it? Or in your case, the $20 million question." As if summoned by their conversation, Thunder Bay approached, his steps soft on the dusty ground. The stallion's eyes were bright and alert, his bearing proud but relaxed. He nuzzled Maverick's shoulder with a gentleness that spoke of trust rather than training. "He's giving you a chance," Colton observed. "The question is what you're going to do with it." Maverick reached up to stroke Thunder Bay's neck, feeling the warmth of the stallion's skin and the steady rhythm of his breathing. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about value or performance or return on investment. He was simply present with this magnificent creature, sharing a moment of connection that couldn't be bought or sold. "I have an idea," he said, quietly, "but I'm going to need your help." 3 months later, the transformation of the Stonefield estate had become the talk of the equine world. The climate-controlled stables had been retrofitted with large openings that allowed free access. 2 expanded pastures. The automated feeding systems had been supplemented with natural grazing areas where horses could choose their own grass. Most revolutionary of all, the rigid training schedules had been replaced with a philosophy that respected each horse's individual nature. At the center of it all stood Thunder Bay, no longer an isolated show horse, but the leader of a herd that included both Maverick's expensive acquisitions and 3 modest mares that Colton had contributed to the experiment. The stallion's coat gleamed not from professional grooming, but from the natural oils that came from rolling in the dirt and running free across the open ground. The performance metrics are interesting, Quinton reported during one of their morning briefings. The horses are actually showing improved health markers across the board. Lower stress indicators, better muscle tone, more natural behaviors. But Maverick was more interested in the metrics that couldn't be measured. The way Thunder Bay's eyes lit up when he approached. The stallion's willingness to engage in training that felt more like play than work. The sense of contentment that seemed to radiate from the entire herd. Colton had accepted Maverick's offer to become the estate's head horseman, bringing his philosophy of respectful partnership to replace the previous model of dominance and control. The transformation hadn't been easy. Several of the original staff had quit rather than adapt to the new approach, and some of the horses had taken months to remember how to make their own choices. The investors are confused, Quinton continued. They're seeing the changes and wondering if you're losing your edge. Maybe I am, Maverick replied, watching Thunder Bay lead the herd toward the stream that now flowed freely through the property. Maybe that's exactly what I needed to lose. The truth was, the changes had extended far beyond the horses. Maverick found himself spending more time outdoors, learning to read the weather and the seasons in ways that no app could teach him. His hands, once soft from a life of pointing and clicking, now bore the calluses of honest work. His schedule, once measured in minutes and optimized for maximum efficiency, now followed the natural rhythms of the animals in his care. There's something else, Quinton said, his tone carefully neutral. The documentary crew wants to know when you'll be available for the final interview. Maverick had agreed to let a filmmaker document the transformation, partly to share what he'd learned and partly to challenge others in his position to reconsider their own relationships with the creatures they claimed to love. The project had grown beyond his original vision, attracting attention from animal behaviorists, ethicists, and business people who were curious about applying these principles to human organizations. Tell them tomorrow at sunset, Maverick said. I want Thunder Bay to be part of the conversation. As if summoned by his name, the stallion lifted his head from the stream and looked directly at Maverick. The connection between them was immediate and unmistakable, not the mechanical obedience of a trained animal, but the genuine affection of a creature who had been given the freedom to choose his own relationships. You know what the most interesting part of all this is? Maverick said to Colton, who was approaching with a bridle in his hand, not to capture Thunder Bay, but to invite him to join them for an afternoon ride. What's that? I thought I was rescuing him from a life of confinement. Turns out he was rescuing me from a life of isolation. Thunder Bay approached willingly, his head low and his eyes soft. The stallion allowed the bridle to be slipped over his head, but it was clear that he was choosing to participate rather than being forced to comply. The difference was subtle but profound, the difference between slavery and partnership, between ownership and stewardship. Ready for a ride? Colton asked, and Thunder Bay's response was immediate, a gentle nicker that spoke of anticipation rather than resignation. As they prepared to mount up, Maverick reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The $20 million check still sat in his desk drawer, unsigned and forgotten. It had been written to purchase a horse, but the real transaction had been something far more valuable, the purchase of his own humanity. 1 year later, the Stonefield Briggs Equine Sanctuary had become a model for a new approach to horse care that emphasized partnership over ownership. The facility hosted visitors from around the world, each seeking to understand how the principles of freedom and respect could be applied to their own relationships with animals. Thunder Bay had become more than a symbol of the transformation. He had become a teacher. His ability to distinguish between genuine horsemen and those who sought to dominate was uncanny, and his responses to visitors had become a kind of litmus test for the authenticity of their intentions. "He's got a gift," Colton observed, watching Thunder Bay interact with a group of young riders who had come to learn about natural horsemanship. "He can read people better than most people can read each other." The stallion moved among the children with infinite patience, allowing the timid ones to approach at their own pace, while setting gentle boundaries with those who were too eager. His presence had a calming effect that extended beyond the immediate moment, teaching lessons about consent, respect, and the difference between force and influence. Maverick stood at the fence, no longer the perfectly groomed businessman who had once valued Thunder Bay primarily as an investment. His clothes bore the honest stains of barn work, his hands showed the calluses of daily labor, and his eyes held a peace that no amount of wealth had been able to purchase. The documentary won another award, Quinton reported, approaching with his ever-present tablet. "The producers want to know if you're interested in a follow-up project." "What kind of follow-up?" "They're calling it The Millionaire's Guide to Finding What Money Can't Buy." They want to profile other wealthy individuals who've discovered that success isn't just about accumulation. Maverick considered the proposal, his gaze never leaving Thunder Bay. The stallion had finished his work with the young riders and was now grazing peacefully in the pasture. His herd spread around him in a natural pattern that spoke of contentment and security. "Only if Thunder Bay approves," he said. "Finally, he's the real teacher here." The response surprised Quinton, who had grown accustomed to the new Maverick but still occasionally expected to encounter the old one. "Sir, with respect, Thunder Bay is a horse. He can't actually approve or disapprove of business decisions. Can't." Maverick's smile was gentle but knowing. "Watch him tomorrow when the film crew arrives. If he's relaxed and engaged, we'll proceed. If he's anxious or withdrawn, we'll find another way to share the message." That evening, as the sun set over the transformed estate, Maverick found himself in the pasture with Thunder Bay. The stallion's head was low, his breathing steady, his posture radiating the kind of contentment that came from a life lived in harmony with one's nature. "Thank you," Maverick said quietly, his words carried away by the gentle evening breeze, "for showing me what I was missing, for teaching me the difference between having and being." Thunder Bay lifted his head, his dark eyes reflecting the last light of day. For a moment, horse and human stood in perfect stillness, two beings who had found in each other something that transcended the boundaries of species and circumstance. The story of the millionaire and the horse had begun with a transaction $20 million in exchange for a magnificent stallion, but it had evolved into something far more valuable, a lesson about the things that truly mattered, the relationships that couldn't be bought, and the freedom that came from choosing authenticity over appearance. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thunder Bay moved closer to Maverick, his warm breath visible in the cooling air. The stallion's proximity was a gift freely given, a sign of trust and affection that no amount of money could have purchased. In the distance, the lights of the mansion still gleamed, a testament to the wealth that had made the transformation possible, but the real treasure was here in the pasture, measured not in dollars, but in the depth of connection between two beings who had learned to see past the barriers that society had taught them to construct. The millionaire had offered luxury, but the horse had chosen love. And in choosing love, he had taught his human companion the most valuable lesson of all, that the richest life was the one lived in authentic relationship with the world around them. Thunder Bay's story would continue to inspire others long after. The documentary cameras had packed up and the awards had been forgotten, because in the end, it wasn't really a story about a horse at all. It was a story about the courage to choose what matters over what merely costs, and the wisdom to recognize that the most valuable things in life have never been for sale.